Hey, Slater Crusaders. So, coronavirus has exposed a lot of weaknesses to our systems. So, an example, we get 96% of our antibiotics from a single country. That's a bad idea. And that's been a bad idea for as long as we've done it. But now that we're in this pandemic and the supply chains are disrupted and could get much, much worse, that bad idea has been exposed for everyone to see. Now it's painfully obvious. Now that dependence on a foreign country for a life-saving thing like antibiotics, that's bad. It's even worse when you realize that all those antibiotics come from China. Why would we ever trust the communists with this much leverage over us? And that's just one thing, that's just antibiotics. Play that game all day long. There's weaknesses all over the place. And a lot of them, again, the coronavirus is exposing. There's a lot of reasons why we wanted to put together this special. Coronavirus is just one of them. And that's why we're here. China exposed, enemy in the East. Here's how we got here.
October 1st, 1949. America watches as Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong declares the birth of the People's Republic of China. Just a year later, American forces battled Chinese troops in the Korean War. 1964, and tensions between the US and China remain tense as Beijing detonates its first atomic bomb. By 1972, relations between the two powers begins to improve as US President Richard Nixon travels to Beijing and meets with Chairman Mao.
This magnificent banquet marks the end of our stay in the People's Republic of China. This was the week that changed the world.
Fast forward to 1979, President Jimmy Carter grants Beijing full diplomatic recognition, 30 years after the founding of Communist China. 10 years later, America freezes relations with China after communist troops kill hundreds of Beijing students in the Tiananmen Square massacre. By 2000, tensions have eased and President Bill Clinton signs the U.S.-China Relations Act, normalizing trade between the two nations. 6 years later, China is America's second largest trading partner after Canada. In 2008, China gained some financial leverage with the U.S., becoming the largest owner of U.S. debt, with about $600 billion in treasury bonds. 2 years later, and Beijing is now the world's second largest economy after the U.S. By 2012, Washington's trade deficit with China hits an all-time high of $295 billion. Then, in March of 2018, President Trump announces sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports and charges Beijing with stealing American technology and intellectual property.
Nice job putting that together, New York. That was really good. I think the important thing to know here is that China is not just some country over there doing its thing. China has ambitions and a vision and an action plan that they're executing to be the world's largest economic player and most influential nation in the world. And it goes without saying, I think, that they have a very different vision of that world than we do. Now, our leaders, they've known this for a long time, and the approach that we've taken over the last few decades, and I could have been convinced that this was a good idea. I could have been convinced that this was the right path to take. But the idea was the more we become connected, right? The more America and China becomes connected, the more we can influence their government, and the more that we can influence the Chinese people for the better, right? We can influence them to embrace Western principles and values. The idea was the more the Chinese economy grows, and we obviously have play a direct role in that, then the more they'll embrace Western norms when it comes to human rights and political reform. That was the idea. That didn't work. And this was exposed for everyone to see during the Hong Kong protests last October, particularly with the NBA. Do you remember this? Remember there was a lot of protests in Hong Kong against China, and the NBA got all mixed up in it. And they would not condemn the Chinese government for cracking down on the protesters. Why not? Why would the NBA not condemn China? Because the NBA makes $4 billion a year in China. So one of the general managers of one of the teams made some tweet supporting Hong Kong, and the Chinese government told the NBA to fire that guy, or else you're out of here. You're out of China. And the NBA caved because they didn't want to lose $4 billion. So that right there, that's a perfect microcosm. The idea was that if the NBA comes into China, maybe that will make China more like America. But instead, the NBA going into China made the NBA more like China. We've thought since the Cold War, we've had this perception that it was just a matter of time before the Chinese follow the path of the Soviet Union and collapse. Right? We had this idea that the great moral arc of history, as Obama would always say, is to follow the path of the West. Right? That if you give it enough time, the end point in man's evolution would be Western liberal democracy for everyone, everywhere. Hillary Clinton said this. She said, the Chinese are trying to stop history, which is a fool's errand. They cannot do it, but they're going to hold it off as long as possible. Hold off what? Right? So the Chinese are trying to stop history, which is a fool's errand. They cannot do it, but they're going to hold it off as long as possible. Hold off what? Hold off becoming a Western liberal democracy. That's what she was talking about. She's saying eventually they'll be more like us. They're trying to hold it off. They're trying to stop history. They're trying to stop the march of history to become more like the West. But she said they won't be able to. I don't think that's right. I think they'll be able to. There's no guarantee that man everywhere will ultimately assemble into a Western democracy. We've only been a country for 244 years. China's been around for thousands of years. We are the blip and the accident of history, not China. Just a little perspective on this. 1500, the year 1500, China and India were pretty much tied for being the largest economies in the world. Both their GDPs in today's dollars, again, this is the year 1500. We weren't even around then. The GDPs of both those countries were $100 billion. France was the third largest economy in the year 1500, 18 billion. That's a huge drop. 100 billion, 18 billion. So for all that history, 500 years until today, and by the way, the Chinese would call that modern history, Asia was the dominant player in the world economy, and it was Europe that was backwards and poor. In 1500, the area that's now called England had a GDP of 5 billion. So you compare China and India, they had a combined $200 billion economy, and England was 5 billion. You fast forward to 1820, England's economy grew. They were the third largest in the world, but they were still a sixth of China. In 1820, China and India were still the dominant players in the world, and England was just starting to make its rise. 1890 is when the US took over the lead from China, and then China, as you heard in the piece there, took it over again in around 2015. So that's, like, I'm talking blip. In the course of thousands of years, there was a 125-year period there when the West was the dominant player. But for the rest of history, that was not the case. So there's no guarantee that the West or America will always be the world's superpower. China's always been, and could be again. I want to take a break here because I want to leave enough time for the guests we have coming up. But we need to start looking at China maybe from a different mindset than you've looked at it, since the Cold War. So we're going to talk with a military expert, talk about the greatest challenges we face with them in that aspect, both traditional and cyber. We're going to talk with a business expert about, what coronavirus has shown with supply routes, but also, again, that 97% of our antibiotics come from China. Like, that's insane, but there's a lot of other things like this. We'll talk about our economic, talk about monetary policy. What does it mean when a country is devaluing its currency? What is that? And then we'll talk about the cultural differences between us and China as well. And hopefully at the end of this, we can have a better perspective of who our enemy truly is. China exposed, enemy in the East. More coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, we want to start off our conversation here about China from a national security military perspective here. So we're going to go to James Carafano from Heritage Foundation. He has a new book out called Surviving the End, and also Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World. Mr. Carafano, how are you, sir?
Good, yes.
Glad you're here. Let's,
Can we just
before we talk about...
I'm sorry. I'm just not doing good. All right, good. Can you do it again? Sorry. Good. I'm serious now. All right.
3, 2, 1.
Oh.
Hey, Hey, Slater Crusaders, want to start off our conversation about China, talking from a national security military perspective. We're going to do that with James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation, author of Surviving the End and Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World. Mr. Carafano, how are you, sir?
Good to be with you.
Glad you're here. So let's, before we get to the military, let's talk coronavirus, and your take on China's initial response to it and why things like this keep coming out of China.
Right. Well, first of all, it's completely irresponsible. Matter of fact, the National Security Advisor was just at the Heritage Foundation yesterday, and he pointed out that the Chinese really cost us 2 critical weeks. In other words, by the time they acknowledged to the world that the disease was spreading, and they provided the kind of information that would enable people to test and track it, essentially the cow is already out of the barn. A lot of people have left after the Chinese New Year and gone back to places like Europe and other places, and they really started the global pandemic. So they are really kind of criminals, 1, and kind of 2 and 3 are countries like Iran and Italy, because they did not restrict travel from China even after they knew the disease was beginning to spread, and they imported mass. So now we're going to have a big problem in the Middle East because of Iran. And there's a large number of migrant Chinese workers in Italy, in northern Italy. We've got a big outbreak there. That means it's guaranteed to spread throughout the Schengen community. That's why we have the travel ban. Essentially, Europe and Iran are the new China, the new sources of exporting the disease.
So fair to say that Trump's initial travel ban from China was the right call?
It was, and what it did is it bought us some time, and I know people are frustrated about the proliferation of testing and everything, but actually what's much more important is the later the disease got here in the flu season, the shorter time Americans really will have to deal with it. So we've basically had a critical 30 days to get through, and I think all the measures that communities and people are taking on social distancing from the NFL, I mean, not the NFL, but the National Hockey League, all that's good stuff. And hopefully if people take that seriously, if people who are not feeling well stay at home, that's going to be the most effective thing getting us through the next 30 days and really preventing a large outbreak here.
Let's move to China in general. So would you say, well, who is our biggest geopolitical threat? And maybe how would you define threat, I guess, even in that question?
Yeah, so I think it's really countries that destabilize the global order that we have, the ability of the United States to operate globally and protect its interests and meet its responsibilities. And when people say, what's the greatest threat? It's like the guy that goes to the doctor and said, the doctor says you have cancer, heart disease, and a brain tumor. Which one do you want me to cure? And you're like, well, doc, I want to live, so deal all 3. We're a global power. We need to operate globally, so we have to be concerned about Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. We might treat them all differently, but we have to be serious about Western Europe, about the Middle East, about the Indo-Pacific. So China is clearly the greatest long-term destabilizing challenge, but it doesn't mean we can ignore the other ones.
Very well said. What's China's vision for the world?
China wants essentially to globally dominate all the resources, people, and tools it needs to be a self-sustaining superpower forever. And so that literally is a band of hard Chinese influence that stretches from the South China Seas all the way through Central Europe.
Okay.
And includes places like Africa and large swaths of the Middle East.
So I'm just trying to visualize that properly. So let's talk about Africa, because I've heard about that a couple of years ago, about their major investments in Africa. What kind of investments, what kind of involvement, and why? What's their play there?
Well, I think 3 things. One is resources. They want to lock in all the resources and all the travel route that those resources would follow. So essentially, they are self-sustaining forever. So cheap resources, Africa's a great source of that. The second one is low-wage manufacturing. Eventually, China recognizes that its economy will grow and they can't produce things the most cheaply. What they want to do is have factories in other places where they can get a piece of that action. So they want to control the low-wage manufacturing that will eventually develop in Africa. And the third is customers. They want to force other people to buy their stuff. So those three things are why Africa has always been a prime target for China.
Wow, that's really interesting. How, and this is a big question because Africa is a big place, but how are the people of Africa embracing Chinese involvement?
Well, they've had a lot of penetration because, one, people haven't really kind of paid attention to it, and two, because the Chinese have bribed and cheated their way into all kinds of places. So, for example, they built the building for the African Union, and the African Union is like, oh, thank you very much, that's great.
Wow.
What they didn't tell you is they basically riddled it with spyware, so they know everything that's going on. Enormous debt, that's another, another way to, you buy up resources, you default on the debt, they take the assets, and of course, bribery. I mean, you have very weak governance in a lot of these places, so the Chinese make 10 people rich, and nobody really bothers that impoverishes, tens of millions.
Supply chain is a big thing that's been talked about lately because of coronavirus and the disruption to it. What you mentioned trading routes, like, and I remember, what's the name of that? It's like the Silk Road Plan or something like that, right? So it's like very old school trading routes that have been around for thousands of years. Why are they still relevant today? And or how are they still relevant today? And why does China want to control them? What do they get with that?
Well, the most important ones are the ones that go by sea. Still 90% of the world's goods are transported by sea. And if you control them, that's part of ensuring that you control everything. So, for example, the South China Seas through the Straits of Malacca, most of the oil and natural gas that Asia consumes come from Russia in the middle. They pass through that area, and so controlling that's super important.
So that's, I want to segue into the South China Sea conversation. So what's that whole thing about?
Well, one, it's about strategically controlling the important waterways that are really the lifeline of Asia. And two, it's really about pushing the United States out of the Indo-Pacific. If you hear this term, first island chain, second island chain, if you look at all the little tiny dots, nations and islands in the second island chain, and you do a map of the Japanese offensive in World War II, where the goal was, let's control enough of the geography, essentially, to prevent the United States from coming into the Indo-Pacific. Those are all the places that China is trying to get in today, from Papua New Guinea to the Marshall Islands to small little islands in the Pacific.
Are they doing it the same way they did Africa? They're doing Africa.
Well, a little different in the sense in the South China Sea, what they're actually doing is militarily occupying these places to limit the capacity of the U.S. to get in. So there's actually two military things when we talk about when we don't. The one we talk about is pushing out the ability of the United States to project power. The other is China's submarines are diesel, which means they don't travel across the world like our nuclear submarines do. And they're still relatively noisy. That is their number one nuclear platform. If they control the South China Seas and we can't essentially monitor that waterway, then they can very quickly deploy their submarines into the South China Seas, and they have a very resilient, effective nuclear force. So it's also about the nuclear balance of power, not talked about as much.
Oh, sorry, excuse my ignorance. Explain that. What's the significance of the diesel-powered subs versus our nuclear ones?
Diesel subs don't have the range that nuclear subs do, right? So if there are two ways to kind of hide your nuclear weapons underwater. One way is like what we do is you have nuclear powered submarines that can go out into the middle of the ocean and stay there forever, and you can't find them. Diesel submarines can't do that. They don't have that range. So what you want to do with a diesel submarine is you want to have waters that the other guys can't get in and look at you. So if you can control the South China Seas, you don't have to get out into the middle of the ocean to hide. You can hide in the South China Seas. That makes your ballistic missile force on submarines way more survivable.
Very interesting. Okay, last question for you. I know we got to go. Rank like how, like who's ahead? I know this is a huge question, right? But like who's ahead in these battles overall? Are we ahead? Are they ahead? And what do we do to make sure that we win?
Yeah. So the short answer is it doesn't matter. I mean, the Chinese want to win without fighting. In other words, they don't want to fight World War III with us, and we don't want to fight World War III with them. what's key in the military competition is that the Chinese never think that, well, if I have to fight, I can win. So that's the number one thing is convince the Chinese that they can never win by fighting. If they want to try to win without fighting, we can compete with them at all day long. So what the president's been doing in building up the U.S. military the last 3 years, super, super important for this. It's really resetting the table with the Chinese.
Great stuff. James Carafano, Heritage Foundation, awesome introduction. Let's talk again. We'll go into more detail with all that one day.
Thanks.
Thanks, James. Appreciate you. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the business aspect, monetary policy, all that kind of stuff going on with China. We'll do that next on our special about China right here on The First. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to welcome, by the way, to our special China Exposed, Enemy in the East. Want to focus more on now economic and a business perspective with China. We're going to do that with former Congressman Dave Brat, who's also currently the Dean of the Business School at Liberty University. Congressman, how are you, sir?
Hey, great, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
I just ask that feel free to speak down to me. Speak as if you're talking to a history major who took a course deemed rocks for jocks to fulfill his math and science requiment in this conversation.
As a history major, you may do better on the economics than the Harvard MBAs have done.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that. Let's talk a little bit about Corona and then ties in because it's all really the same here with China in general. So one thing that Corona has done is exposed some problems with our supply chains. I know we talked about this a little bit last time you were on our show, but what are people starting to realize now that I'm sure you've seen coming for a long time?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of making fun of the Harvard MBA, but all the smartest guys in the room and women, et cetera, over the past decade have been just looking for cost reduction. That's it, efficiencies. And they found it in China and even some of the outlying countries surrounding them now where the wage rates are even cheaper. And they've just gone all in and lost all perspective, right? At Liberty University, the first thing you learn in a finance course is diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket for good reason. And now we're learning the lesson the very hard way of what happens, right? I mean, so you have Chinese car manufacturers down 92%, right? Down 92%, right? So 8% left in the first part of February, et cetera. And, Apple phones and then the pharmaceutical drugs. I think everybody knows the stat. Now we have 85% of the ingredients manufactured over in China and India, et cetera. And so we've lost control. We have one manufacturer of the masks left in the country. And so, I mean, there's a national security threat going forward if we continue to do this. There's an economic threat. And in the simplest terms, you can boil this crisis down to about two sentences, right? A communist Chinese regime is responsible for the coronavirus, right? And then lack of transparency. So the virus is the fault of a communist regime who can't, a big state that can't organize life for their people, and then covers up. And then secondly, the economic dislocations you've seen are the fault of our supply chains being located in China. If those supply chains were not located in China, you would not have these severe economic dislocations. And that's the part that's missing from the conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What kind of dislocations are you expecting? So I read something the other day that we talked about there's tier 1 suppliers and then tier 2 suppliers, right? So the analysis was Volkswagen has 5,000 tier 1 suppliers, so companies that give them parts. But each one of those companies has on average 250 suppliers. So really, to make a Volkswagen, it requires over 1 million companies,
right,
and suppliers all over the world. So what kind of disruptions are we to see here because of all of this Corona stuff?
Yeah, well, it depends on the spread of the virus, to state the obvious. And it's not all clear what's going to happen there. And so China, the Wuhan, region supposedly has plateaued. And the Chinese are asking folks to go back to work. So we'll see about that. I haven't seen the latest reports on that. But then it's interesting, do you get phase 2? And the plateau could be due to the fact that China is no longer testing. So when they report there's no new cases, that's what they're reporting, minimal new cases, which I find very strange. That could just be because the government isn't testing anyone anymore in that region, right? So then they say we haven't tested when there's no new reports. And so this R score is key, and I don't want to be alarmist, but even if you follow conservative, this R score with one person passes it on to two people, the growth there, the exponential growth kicks in 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Go plug that into your Excel spreadsheet and just draw the cursor down a full page. And the way the math works out is even at that conservative rate, the whole country of the U.S. is covered in 4 months with the spread of this virus, unless we get our act together and start making some tough calls. And I think President Trump's starting to make some of those tougher calls with the shutting down European travel, this kind of thing. So supply chain thing, it just depends. If we're going to keep shutting things down, if Europe shuts things down, then you get a very severe economic impact, and the supply chain dislocation is even worse, as you were saying. It's all interconnected. And if you got, 1 or 2 countries out of the loop and you're dependent on them for production, you're shut down.
Amazing. The same article said that of the top 1,000 Fortune companies, 938 have a tier 2 supplier out of Wuhan. Wuhan, a place I've never even heard of a couple weeks ago. And almost all the top companies have some connection to Wuhan. Like, what in the world?
Right.
So let's bring that back around. So let's talk about trade deficits in general. So I used to read a lot of, I still do, but Don Boudreaux, economist out of George Mason, right? It's a very free market guys, right?
Yep.
So one of his main crusades is like, listen, you trade deficit guys, critical of Trump, very critical of Trump. It's not about the trade deficit. The flip side of trade deficit is capital account surplus. It's not a bad thing. We're getting stuff from China. We pay them, but we're getting low cost stuff, and that's better because now we have higher standard of living. We have more things, and we have more money to spend on other things. So talk about trade deficit and explain to me and explain to people like Don Boudreaux why it is inherently bad and something we need to fix.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to mess with Boudreaux. I like him a lot. He's very good. And he's correct. The economists are correct when they're talking just about economics. Of course, you don't want tariffs. You don't want anything that impinges on free markets and the free flow of goods and services and information, right? The prices really convey an infinite amount of information. And that's what Boudreaux will tell you. But the issue arises in the U.S., everyone kind of gets it, right? In order to have a free people, you have to have the rule of law. And the libertarians are a little reluctant to get in that conversation, right? I say it's nice for you guys to show up at 1900 with a liberty thing when us Christian, Judeo-Christian guys were fighting the Huns and the Goths for the last 2,000 years. And you guys show up lately. So, skip over the history part, but they don't get the significance of institutions. And so what's missing is now at the international level, we do not have an understanding of the norms we're going to operate under, right? So in the U.S., you got the Constitution, rule of law, private property rights, all necessary to have free markets work. At the international level, we set it up, right? We made friends, shows our goodwill with the Germans, the Japanese, our arch enemies. We made friends with them. We traded together. We got richer. Underneath an agreed upon set of a liberal order called the Bretton Woods system, right? United Nations, the IMF, World Bank, all that, that we set up after the war. Well, now the 800-pound gorilla comes to the room. China, they don't play by any of the rules, right? They're doing currency manipulation, stealing our intellectual property. We let them do that. They're not a free market. We don't even put them in our economic models because they don't have any markets that work. There is no price system. So they're not a market system. And so that's where the Boudreaux or whatever will have to do some new analysis and say, how do you operate free markets when one of your lead partners isn't free at all? And they have no problem damaging their own people for economic gain. And that's the partner you're dealing with, right? So we want a win-win outcome. The Chinese people are great. We got no beef there. It's with 50 guys in the Communist Party over there that party runs their government and that party runs their military. and they're up in the sky, and they got a document called China 2025 and China 2050 that says they're at economic war with us. And the U.S. is full of a bunch of nice people that are, Midwest nice, and we're getting rolled by them. So we got to wake up.
Let me play. I'm totally with you. Let me play one more devil's advocate, because I remember this analysis too from the free market guys. Steel, Chinese steel. So assuming the quality is the same, right? That variable, of course. If the Chinese government wants to dump steel in America,
right,
the free markets would say, that's awesome. Thanks for that gift of free steel. You're hurting your own people over there, China, and you're giving us this free steel. We can build bridges for nothing now. Thank you very much for that. What's the problem with that?
Well, again, I mean, the analogy right now would be the economics. They're right. That's all fine. But then the same thing applies to pharmaceuticals. So they can make the pharmaceutical, manufacture it way cheaper, and let's just trade until you get a pandemic. Well, that'll never happen. Yeah, you're never going to have a pandemic. Oops, we got a pandemic. So China, please send, we're trading, we're free trade, right? Free trade, efficiency, it's all good. So, we want to put in a trade, and please send us all those ingredients we need. No, we're not going to send them to you. Oops, and there's your problem, right? And so the free traders have to respond to that issue, which is the issue right now. And they don't get to go off and do their economic models that show perfect efficiency with all the characteristics of free markets when you don't have free markets.
Yeah, really good. And 97% of our antibiotics come from China. It's loco.
All
right,
it's amazing.
Let me. We got a few minutes, and I'm putting you in an unfair spot, but
good.
Really talk down to me on monetary policy. This is a huge topic, right? But when I hear, let me just focus on this one: devaluing currency.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, the Chinese can make, it gets into how you want to compete globally. So if one country says we're going to make our currency cheaper to help export our goods, and that's the way we're going to compete, then the other country has to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to keep our currency strong and they get an export advantage? Are we going to devalue along with them and then have a race to the bottom? And it's complex because, there's 200 currencies in the world, there's 200 countries or whatever. And so it's a very complex equilibrium because it's not just about us and China, then everybody else has to weigh in. And so what you want is, a stable monetary regime. And, Milton Friedman suggested a monetary rule where your money growth just matches GDP growth. And I would love that, right? And so, but the problem is the Chinese, they play for their own advantage, and the U.S. has set up a global order which made everyone better off. And the last 50 years is the evidence, right? The post-World War II record, we all got rich together. We all liked each other. We didn't go to war with each other. Great 50-year run. And now the 800-pound gorilla is coming in the room and upsetting the apple cart. And so all bets off. And that's just one piece. That's just one piece. There's other pieces we can get into.
So I totally understand, there's all these different currencies. Can you break it down in just a very simple two currency system? So you mentioned like stronger or weaker dollar and help exports or hurt imports. What helps imports? What hurts imports?
Yeah. So if the dollar, if we weaken the dollar, then that makes our goods cheaper to the rest of the world, right? So you have a weaker dollar. And then we cannot buy with that weaker dollar as much imports, right, of Chinese goods as we would have in the past. But it helps our exporters because our goods are cheaper, right? Our automobiles are 10% cheaper or whatever. And then all else equal, China likes the cheaper car, right? And our goods are relative. It's all relative prices, right? So our dollar becomes relatively stronger. So we can import stuff. And, the free traders would say, what's wrong with that, right? You're getting a bunch of, cheaper stuff from China. And that is good if you're just looking at a consumption society, et cetera. But now we're seeing the implications when things run amok. Then we got some issues to address.
How does China manipulate their currency? Like what mechanisms do they do to use?
Well, yeah, I mean they're just a command economy. So I mean if they run into a mess of any sort, right? In the U.S., we can print money too, right? We have 4 trillion. We've been playing with funny money, and now the interest rate's zero again, right? So how do you do that? Well, you create a bunch of money. The supply of money goes through the roof, and if you have a supply, if there's 1 million basketballs out there, well, the value of the basketballs go down, relatively speaking, right? And so there's a ton of money out there. You just print a ton of money. Well, the value of each dollar goes down, relatively speaking, and it's weaker. And so China can just do that. They're a command system. We have some checks and balances here. The president can get mad at the Fed. The Congress can hold hearings to ask the Fed questions. They're supposed to be independent. But they've produced a sugar high, right? The John Taylor, who followed Milton Friedman, the Taylor rule in economics is fairly famous. And Taylor said, if you go back and look at the 04, 05, 06 money supply went through the roof. They printed money. That money had to go somewhere. Where did it go? It didn't go into solid investments. It went into just crazy real estate vehicles and new investment vehicles they created, right? And you can go back into all that history. And that created the 08 financial crisis, according to John Taylor. And everybody can go Google that. So if you got too much money in the system, it creates bubbles. The money's got to go somewhere. Is it going to rational investments always? Doesn't look like it, right? So that you got to keep some sanity in the house, and we have not been doing that. But we keep doing it to bail us out of the next recession, which we don't want either.
No, and it's not looking good right now. Former Congressman Dave Bratt, Dean of the Liberty Business School, where clearly I need to go because I have
hey, you can
a
come
lot
speak
to learn.
anytime. We'd love to have you.
Speak, please. I need to be in the audience.
Yeah, you got
Congressman,
plenty to teach our students.
Appreciate that. Thank you, brother. We'll talk again.
Hey, thanks, Mike. You bet.
We'll wrap up here. Coming up next, China exposed enemy in the East. Mike Slater right here on The First. Hey, Slater Crusaders, great honor to talk to our next guest, Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China. And please follow him on Twitter, particularly through all this coronavirus stuff. Gordon G. Chang on Twitter. Mr. Chang, how are you, sir?
I'm fine, Mike, and it's a great honor to be on your show.
Thank you, sir. Big picture. We did an analysis earlier, a couple days ago, actually, about how a lot of Americans, I think, look at China still through a Cold War lens. It's sort of like this backwards country and all that, right? But I don't know if that's necessarily true. So I just want to throw it to you. What do we in the West need to understand about China?
I think the most important thing is that Xi Jinping, the ruler of the country, believes that he is the world's only legitimate ruler and that China is the world's only sovereign state. I know that sounds ludicrous, but he has been talking in that direction for decades, and recently he's become much more explicit about it. So we got to understand that at least at the top of the Communist Party, they view the Americans as subjects. And I think that's the lens that we need to view our relationships with Beijing.
Super important. Where does that come from for them in their history and maybe even his personal history? Where does that idea come from?
That comes from China's imperial era, where emperors thought that they had the mandate of heaven over Tianxia meaning all under heaven. And they believed that they were compelled and actually compelled to order and rule the entire world, and that peoples near and far had an obligation to acknowledge Chinese rule. So we're dealing with a very old concept, but one which has been brought back by Xi Jinping and a few of his predecessors.
And you think he really truly believes that, or is he using that to maintain power?
Well, he's using that, I think, to maintain power, but he also believes it. So, for instance, there's a new propaganda song that talks about Xi Jinping as father of the world. And at least in this context, that is ominous. And we know that he's been employing scholars to study the application of Tianxia to the world. So he's serious about this.
Yeah. Let's talk about the people of China. And obviously, there's 1.4 billion. This is a huge question. But let's start here. Culturally, what's different about people of China versus Americans? Something that, as an American who's grown up this particular way my whole life, I maybe wouldn't realize.
Yeah, well, American culture is much more free and open. We live in a democratic society. China hasn't been a democratic society except for maybe one day in 1912. So that is a difference. And the Chinese people are struggling to have a greater say in their lives. They obviously have a different history from us, but in very many ways, they're just like us. And they have the same aspirations as we do. And without the Communist Party ruling them, we'd probably have a pretty good relationship with Beijing.
Yeah, so I'm thinking back to our exploits in the Middle East, where we want to bring democracy to the Middle East. Could that? We're not going to talk about the means of doing that, but could that happen in China? Could the Chinese people want that?
Well, I think the Chinese people do want that, especially in their reaction to the coronavirus epidemic. They've been now talking openly about fundamental political change because they realize that the disease here is communism. Whether it'll happen, that's only the future to tell, of course. I think it's not impossible. Of course, it's going to be unlikely to move from a semi-totalitarian state to democracy in one jump. But nonetheless, I think the Chinese people eventually will get it right. But unfortunately now, that's not the reality. The reality is we're dealing with a hostile regime that has declared the U.S. To be its enemy. They declared people's war on us last May. And as we've seen from their recent statements, they believe that we've committed germ warfare against them. So this is going to be a very trying time for Americans.
How do they view us? And maybe that's two-part. How do they view? I guess we can always differentiate between the leaders and the people, and I guess that's true in America too, right? So maybe how do the Chinese leaders view the American leaders, and how do the Chinese leaders view the American people?
I think that Chinese leaders, especially Xi Jinping, look at President Trump and sort of scratch their heads. They don't like his policies, but more important, they don't like his unpredictability. And so therefore, we have seen Chinese Communist Party propaganda recently start to promote Joe Biden over both Bernie Sanders and President Trump. I think the Chinese people actually like President Trump. There have been a number of these internet polls, which of course are not scientific, but President Trump always comes out as the most popular. And it's because he just says what he thinks. He says off the top of his head. And these are things that the Chinese people don't see in their own leaders, who are anything but spontaneous. So Trump is popular, I think, among Chinese people.
Do you think the leaders in China respect Trump, even if they, don't like him?
Well, they certainly don't like him. I think that they do respect him, largely because he's been much more resolute, much more robust. They have been able to push him in directions that they like. And so, to a certain extent, they don't know what Trump's going to say. But I do think that on general, they do not want him back in office, largely because he has sponsored policies and has said things which are much more tough. And also, the front runner in the Democratic Party has basically said China's not competition for us, signaling that there's going to be some pretty irresolute policies on Beijing should Joe Biden become president.
Yeah, which is the problem. If you're the average person in China, try to help me and us understand what kind of controls the government has on your life, whether it's where you can travel or what information you get. What's it like for the average person living in China?
Well, it's becoming much more restrictive. Of course, China, because it's a communist state, has censorship. There is something called the Great Firewall, which is the most sophisticated set of internet controls that separate the Chinese people from the outside. And those controls are being applied more vigorously these days. Also, China's putting in place its social credit system, which is going to be nationwide. It's going to give every Chinese resident a score, which will be constantly updated based on observable behaviors. I think this year the regime plans to have 626 million surveillance cameras in place. So it's going back to something which is familiar in the Maoist era. I don't think most Chinese people like this, but they don't have a choice.
What's the end goal of the social credit system, or maybe what's the government's goal, and then what do you think the end result of it's going to be?
Well, the government's goal is to modify behavior so that everybody is compliant. And so it's like a herd of sheep. I don't think that the government will actually get there. This is a very difficult thing to do, but they are applying all their resources to it. And so they will have something in place. And we'll just see how effective it is. Right now, Chinese people are white hot angry over the government's mishandling of the coronavirus epidemic. So they're not about to be corralled. We'll see what happens after the virus subsides, because at that point, the recriminations will begin. And remember, spring is the revolutionary season in China. So this is a very difficult time for Xi Jinping.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned it twice, and I'm sorry I didn't go back to it the first time, about the people of China's reaction to the response to Corona. Because I've heard a lot of people in America look at China's response and say, wow, because they're a totalitarian state, they're able to do the necessary quarantines and crackdowns that we're not, because we're more of a free country, and kind of praise it, albeit they're communists, right? So what's your insight on how people really in China are reflecting on their response?
Well, the people in Wuhan are really upset about what's going on. There are people under quarantine because they're at the epicenter. So, for instance, it was last week that a Chinese vice premier toured a Wuhan neighborhood, and her tour was interrupted by jeers and boos and by calls that everything she was seeing was fake, because they were saying the local officials cleaned everything up before she arrived. People are not very happy. Many Chinese have adopted "Do You Hear the People Sing" as their anthem. And that's the politically charged song from Les Miserables. That's what the people in Hong Kong did too, as well. So there is this, I guess you could say, an air of resistance right now. I think it probably will last. The Soviet Union fell 5 years after Chernobyl. It might not take that long for the Chinese people to rouse themselves and to get to a better form of government.
Interesting. What posture, we can talk policy if you want, but also what posture do you think the American government should take against China moving forward to help the people move in that direction?
Well, right now, the first thing we need to do is to protect the American people, because the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Communist Party are accusing the U.S. of germ warfare. That's laying the justification for lashing out at the U.S. We need to deter China. I think we need to speak to the Chinese people about the origins of the coronavirus, because we're being blamed for it. And I think by doing that, we create a dynamic in China that undermines the Communist Party, which we absolutely have to do. It's unfortunate. We don't want to do it as a nation. But nonetheless, I think China is driving us to a point where we have no choice. So this is exceedingly dangerous right now. I'm not saying China's going to attack the U.S., but I am saying that the elements for great tragedy now exist, and we've got to be very careful and make sure that we make the Chinese understand that there will be costs for what they're doing.
And the media plays right into their propaganda. Our media does. Why does the media and why does the left in America romanticize the communists?
That's a great question, which I'm probably not qualified to answer. But, they're always leftist strain in the United States. You see that, for instance, with what Bernie Sanders represents. It's certain populism, but also leftism. And it's just a natural reaction, I suppose, that we have these waves that the American pendulum swings. But it's really dangerous here, of course, because we can see what socialism really means. It's Venezuela, it's Cuba, it's China. It is just horrible. And unfortunately, people sort of, as you say, romanticize it, and they slough off what it really means, or what it would really mean for the United States.
Yeah. My last question for you, Mr. Chang. I'm so grateful for your time. What would you say is the biggest global ambition that China has that most people are not aware of? Earlier in the show, we talked about Africa. We talked a little bit about the Arctic. What would you say China is mostly looking at that we're not paying attention to?
Everything. They're looking at ruling everything. That's Xi Jinping. That's his notion of Tianxia, that we all are subjects to China. He can't compel us to accept it, but nonetheless, he's promoting it, and he will continue to promote it for as long as he rules China.
Gordon Chang, the Twitter is Gordon G. Chang, and the book is The Coming Collapse of China. Go buy it, and please follow Gordon right now because he's been doing an amazing job following all the Corona stuff. Mr. Chang, an honor. Let's talk again, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Mike.
Appreciate you. That concludes our special, China Exposed, Enemy in the East. Obviously, we'll be following this with all the insight that we've gathered today. Thanks for being here. Mike Slater, spread the word.